Hello, everyone. This is Lauren from the Adult Services Department at Shaker Heights Public Library, and you are watching Sourdough Basics from Starter to Your First Bake, Part 1. We're going to talk a little bit about the science of sourdough and how to get started on your very own sourdough culture. Part 2, we'll actually put that culture to work and make our very first loaf of sourdough bread. So, when I talk about sourdough baking, what does that really mean? Well, this is a very, very old, ancient method of baking that does not rely on using yeast that you would think of as the kind that you buy at the store. Instead, this is a technique that uses wild yeast, which are the yeast in your everyday environment. They're floating through the air, they're on the surfaces in your home. And this method of yeast baking is thought to have originated with flatbreads back in Egypt around 3000 BC. And it's those wild yeast in that everyday environment that help the baked goods to rise. So, yeast is yeast. Not quite. There are some differences between the store-bought yeast in the grocery and the wild yeast that you're going to grow out in a sourdough culture. So, when we look at the store-bought yeast, that is a specific strain of yeast that has been selected and bred to have these very specific properties. When you use that store-bought yeast, you're going to get products that have a very consistent feel. They're going to rise the same way. Your texture is going to be very consistent. It's going to have, unfortunately, very little flavor. The raw dough is pretty firm and it holds its shape well. So, if you're the kind of person who wants to do those very intricate braided breads, you're probably going to use the store bought yeast to do that. A drawback is that using that store bought yeast, your baked goods tend to go stale very quickly. Now, when we move over to the wild yeast, we are referring to a yeast culture that's like an ecosystem in a jar. In order to properly allow the dough to rise, you need to give that sourdough yeast time to ferment. When you do, you're going to get a very tangy flavor. It's a little bit sour. You can actually make it more sour by letting it ferment even longer. In terms of the raw dough, with sourdough, the dough itself is more moist and it's going to want to spread. So that's why you'll see a lot of sourdough bakers who allow their baked goods to rise in little bowls or containers or baskets. One of the benefits to using sourdough is that your baked goods do tend to stay fresh longer and they retain moisture a little bit better. There is a little bit of science to kind of explain what is happening within your sourdough culture and how it ferments to allow that product to rise. It basically comes down to the relationship between wild yeast and then these bacteria called lactobacilli that live in that culture right alongside the wild yeast. And they have this beautiful relationship where each of them does a little thing that benefits the other, and they just play along like fantastic neighbors. So basically, as you combine your flour and your water, there's enzymes that break that flour down into starches and simple sugars. The lactobacilli, they like to eat the maltose sugars, and they create a substance called lactic acid, which is what gives you the sourness of your sourdough products. Now, the yeast are going to eat on different sugars. They like glucose and fructose. And as they're munching down on those sugars, they're producing carbon dioxide and ethanol. And it's the carbon dioxide that helps your product to rise. The carbon dioxide gets trapped in this very stretchy protein net that's basically the gluten or the protein in the flour. And because that CO2 keeps building up under that net, it causes the dough to become inflated. Now, the lactic acid and the ethanol create this very acidic environment that's really hostile to other microorganisms, which means that the only folks who are going to be really happy living in your sourdough culture are the yeast and the lactobacilli. So, before I get into how to create your own sourdough culture, I want to encourage you to have a little bit of fun. Um, the idea that this culture is going to be living with you day to day, that it is, in fact, a collection of organisms, go ahead and name it. It's going to be important that you take care of this organism in order to use it over time. So, name it and treat it a little bit like a pet. This is a photo of my sourdough culture that I have been growing on my home kitchen counter. And when trying to think about a name that would be appropriate, I was considering all of the little yeasts everywhere inside that culture, and it just hit me like a truck. Celeste Ng has quite the famous book called Little Fires Everywhere. We have little yeasts everywhere, and so Celeste was born. So now you're ready to grow out your own culture. There's really just a few simple things that you'll need. You want flour, water, a clean container, plastic wrap, or a clean kitchen towel. A kitchen scale is helpful but not absolutely necessary, and you will need loads of patience. This process can take 1 to 2 weeks depending on the environment in your house. If you've got a very cool home, then it's going to take longer than if you had a very warm home. You also want to consider the type of flour that you use. You want to avoid bleached flour at all costs. If you use an all purpose flour, just a general all purpose flour, that's going to take a little bit longer to grow out your culture. If you use a flour that has a whole component to it, like a whole wheat flour or a rye flour or even a spelt flour, those types of cultures are going to grow out a little bit faster. So, day one, in a clean container, you're going to combine 4 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of water. And if you don't have a kitchen scale handy, that is approximately 3/4 of a cup plus an additional 2 tablespoons of flour and then a half a cup of water. Stir that really well to combine everything completely. You don't want any unmixed flour. You're going to cover that lightly with some plastic wrap or even just drape a clean towel over top of your container. Leave it undisturbed on your counter out of direct sunlight. You're going to go back to it on day two. Discard about half of what you have in your starter container. Stir in another 4 ounces each of flour and water. Cover it the same way and let it rest. Day three, you may start to see some signs of activity. You can maybe see a smidge of that in the picture that I have to the side here. This is my day three with Celeste, and I'm starting to see little tiny bubbles in there. But again, I'm going to do the same thing. Discard about half of what I have in the starter, stir in another 4 ounces each of flour and water, cover, and let it rest. All right. Keep on keeping on. Day four, monitor for signs of activity. Discard half of the starter. Stir in another 4 ounces each of flour and water. Cover and let it rest. Day five, same thing. And really, day six and day seven and day eight and day nine, however long it takes to get that culture active. And when I'm talking about signs of activity, I'm talking about little bubbles and the rise and fall of the culture. Now, if you want to kind of understand what the bubbles look like, I've got some photos at the bottom here. On day four, Celeste has a few bubbles on top. Day five, she has a few more. It's starting to smell tangy and sweet. And then the largest picture over here on the right is Celeste at about day 8 or 9. You can see that the culture is getting a little bit thicker and there's a lot of bubbles in there. There's a lot of activity. Okay, so rise and fall. I've got a picture here to demonstrate what it is that you're looking for. There are 2 lines that you'll see marked out on the jar, and then there's kind of a squiggly arrow. The lower line on the left side of the jar was the height of the culture right after I finished feeding it. The line at the top is where I marked the highest point that the culture rose as the yeast and bacteria in there were digesting all of those sugars. And then the squiggly line shows the direction that the culture then fell back to its previous level right after feeding. Once your culture reliably begins to double up and then shrink back down within a 6 to 8 hour period directly after feeding, then you know that it's time and you can try and do a test bake using your sourdough culture. Thanks for watching Sourdough Basics Part 1. Be sure to check out Part 2, where we put our cultures to work and make our very first loaf of sourdough bread.